Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around our spinning globe. Welcome to the latest episode. I think it no, 100, number 106 and still going strong, to my own amazement, of Capitals Uncovered, the Pelle, Neroth, Taylor, and Martin Sieff show. And we are very glad to say, a returning guest this week, very highly thought of by Pelle and myself, fearless independent commentator, uh, who is intimidated by no one, who uh, fearlessly exposes what should be obvious to the entire world media and is often far too little shown. From the New York area, we have again veteran analyst and commentator Mike Averko, a particular expert on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Mike, welcome back. How has the world changed since we had you on last?
Even more interesting and troubling than before, gentlemen.
Oh, no. Tell us how and why, Mike.
Well, I just heard Lawrence Wilkerson make the analogy of how the Spanish Civil War was used as a big power testing ground for modern warfare. And he compared it with how the collective West is now essentially using Ukraine to see how well the latest wonder weapon will work. I mean, we've already seen what the HIMARS, Javelins, Bradleys, Leopards, Abrams, Challengers, and F-16s have done. As Lindsey Graham put it, it's fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, which, by the way, something that Zelensky noted before he went uber nationalist. And the same is true of the former Prime Minister Tymoshenko when she chided Mertz's enthusiasm for the Kiev regime to continue fighting. This is, a last ditch effort on the part of the regime to maintain some status in this warped cause of poking the bear. Keep in mind that, it was up till like March 1945, London was still getting hit with German missiles, but yet, World War II, everyone knew was on the verge of ending, but this still happened. This is what sort of manner is exhibited in a last-ditch effort by fanatics to hopefully create discord that will somehow change the course of things. All it does, at the least, is delay the inevitable.
Yeah.
Well, you make a...
I'll say, Natalie,
go ahead, Pelle.
Talk shit, The Guardian. I hate to quote that newspaper, but and not because I
I know
believe
you
it,
do.
but that's where people are at. Not necessarily our audience, but our audience might have been glancing at The Guardians. And according to Natalie Tocci of The Guardian, the Ukrainians, she's in Kiev walking around, and the Ukrainians think they're winning, and they've been more optimistic at any time in the last 4 years. I think this was before the latest strikes. And then they sent their 2-star reporters to Moscow, and they say the mood has never been worse. And of course, you've got all these pieces in the Telegraph in London saying Putin's on his last legs. At last, we've turned the tide. At the same time as the Brits are buying Russian oil again, because they've run out. At the same time as we hear that John Helmer said yesterday that the White House being stuffed with Bitcoin to stay out of the confrontation. At the same time as just Rubio and Lavrov have a chat today, where Rubio seems a very hands-off stance, no warnings, no threats, and said he's willing to help resolve the conflict, which I take as the Trump giving perhaps a kind of go-ahead. Otherwise, Tass would have said so otherwise, I think. But at the same time, Ryabkov, who's the deputy foreign minister, think that the risks of nuclear war are growing, and we've seen a lot of talk about the Sarmats and the Oreshnik was struck Kiev, and at the same time, Belarus seems to be kind of in the news, in the sort of news cloud, verb and word cloud that you sometimes see on Twitter. You get an idea that is it because the West is going to hit Belarus, or are they going to hit Kaliningrad? Are there any of those issues that you want to pick up on that sort of you think are worth raising out of this sort of buzz, the noise of various news events that are happening?
Sure. Well, Belarus is interesting because as Zelensky has been making waves at Belarus. He greeted their Juan Guaido, Svetlana Tikhonovskaya in Kiev, Tikhonovskaya. And, she's, this Western recognized leader of Belarus, who is not actually the president of Belarus. And this could be another effort on the part of Zelensky to try to initiate a provocation with Belarus,
Yes.
and then say to the West, look, I'm being attacked on both fronts. You have to do something to help me. He's the one who's desperate, not Russia. And this is why he carries on in the way he does. And, Lukashenko has, wisely tried to brush this off, not giving it too much attention. Belarus is no threat at all to the Kiev regime, and I don't see it likely in the immediate future of Russian forces attacking, or Russian and Belarus forces attacking from Belarus into Kiev regime-controlled Ukraine. This will only be done at the provocation of the Kiev regime, much like how the special military operation was instituted. Months before the special military operation, I had the privilege of being on an RT-aired show that came out of Britain called Renegade. And I had the honor of playing follow-up to Scott Ritter, which is a tough act to follow. And I was asked, do I think that Russian forces are going to attack? And I said, look, yes or no? I said no. But I said, if they do attack, it's because the situation with Donbass has gotten out of hand. And sure enough, that is what happened. I mean, in the week leading up to the Russian special military operation, the OSCE observers noted a sharp increase of Kiev regime strikes into Donbass, in addition to the buildup that was occurring of Kiev regime forces. And you also had Macron 1 month early in January telling Putin that Minsk is dead. So, I mean, Russia had to act. Otherwise, you would have another Operation Storm-like incident that's referring to the ethnic cleansing of 150,000 to 250,000 ethnic Serbs from Krajina by Croatia in August and September of 1995. And, the collective West, they basically put that aside. That was not a human rights concern for them.
Yeah, I remember that.
Much like this savage attack on the school. And I have a good deal to say on that, if I may.
Yeah, do.
Please go ahead. Exactly.
Just give us the background, tell it to someone who's been out hiking in the mountains for 5 days,
Yeah. Well, look, Western mass media, for you folks out there who rely on it, and you're out there because, they're listening to this show. I know I speak with them. I tell them about this show. They know about, over the weekend, it was a lead BBC News headline about how Russia struck Kiev with some Rezhnev missiles, doing a lot of damage and killing 4 people. Okay. No mention at all of what transpired beforehand. And what transpired beforehand, which they did not cover at all on the day of it, was this savage, brutal strike on a school in Lugansk. Okay, it's a school that's been around for a while, if anyone bothers to research the matter, that teaches young people to become teachers. Now, initially, the Kiev regime denied this happened, but then they said, yeah, this school, they were instructing drone instructors. Ridiculous. There's no proof of it. And is that a place where you would have such an operation? It's ridiculous. And the pathetic, evasive response of the Western nations at the UN Security Council meeting called by Russia to discuss it is a tell-all that, this savage attack did indeed happen. Killing 21 people. And mind you, okay, it killed 21 people with segmented wave of drone attacks. This Russian retaliation was much more potent in its lethality, but yet that targeted, its purpose was to target military assets. That only killed 4 people. So which side is really, targeting civilians? What was really incredulous about the BBC segment that I saw on this Russian retaliatory strike was they mopped up with John Herbst, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's affiliated with the Atlantic Council. I guess he's probably their point man or lead point man, one of them on Ukraine.
Yes.
He incredulously says that, well, the Russians did this action because they're having trouble on the battlefield, and so they take it out on the Ukrainian civilians. In reality, that's more in sync with how the Kiev regime has behaved. And this goes back years prior to Russia's special military operation, back to 2015. Between 2015 and 2022, hundreds and quite likely thousands of residents in Donbass were killed by Kiev regime action. And I have testimony from people who are ethnic Ukrainian from Ukraine who traveled back there, not in the last few years, but they're in contact with friends and family there. Mind you, these people identify themselves as Ukrainian. They're not anti-Russian, but they identify themselves as Ukrainian, and they acknowledge to me the Kiev regime hit civilian areas where clearly it was just civilian. There were no rebels, there were no weapons, there were no bombs, anything like that being made there, and they hit it flippantly. And they did it in this instance in Lugansk too. I think it was calculated. You note that they did it in 3 segmented wave patterns over a period of time. And the idea was to intimidate rescue efforts. And if people went in there to rescue, to maybe kill them as well. It's a bizarre way of trying to bring the war home, which gets me back to the BBC, because several weeks before, the BBC's Sarah Rainsford, I think you two are familiar with her. I have a lot to say about her disgusting, bigoted journalism.
Yeah.
She had a segment on Kiev regime drone operators with an emphasis on the need to give the Russian public a reality check, as if they don't know about the Odessa massacre. They don't know what I mentioned about what was going on before 2022. Never mind the attacks on Kursk and Volgograd and elsewhere. I mean, it really is ridiculous. And, she's a state-funded propagandist, and this is evident because her prior posting was not in Kiev, but in Moscow. And whenever she was in Moscow doing segments with this dull, dour, depressing look, it was always negativity in her reportage about Russia, whether it was the Russian government or the general Russian position. And she has used words like brutal to describe Russian military action. She never uses that to describe Kiev regime action. By the way, the BBC too, for that matter, I've never heard them use such words to describe Israeli action too, for that matter. So they sent this bigoted imagery of brutal Russians. And I get a lot of that. And I mean, it gets to a point where I have to chuckle. I live in an area, I have a lot of pro-Israeli friends and acquaintances, and they'll casually tell me, yeah, those Russians can be brutal. And so I say to them, really? I mean, what's going on in Gaza? And they're like, well, they're savages, they're animals. And I'm like, oh, okay, we're going to go there. Fine. And, these Banderite types are angels. They're so duped by the neocon, neolib spin in the U.S. They don't recognize that in Israel on May 9th, Victory Day, that's a national holiday, as it is in Russia. They don't know that even the Israeli government, which often follows U.S. policy, even they have condemned the Ukrainian government whenever they honor figures like Andrei Melnik and Stepan Bandera.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians were disproportionately active in the Holocaust, weren't they? And manning Auschwitz and so on. And they never talk about that.
Well, yeah. And let me say this too. I had an article John, excuse me, Martin and myself, along with some other North Americans, we used to write for this venue, the Strategic Culture Foundation,
Indeed,
before
we did.
the government cancel cultured us from doing so.
Yes.
But I had an article on this World War II figure, Andrei Vlasov, who was a well thought of at the time before his capture Soviet general. And he, collaborated with the Nazis, but his forces and his manner nowhere neared what the Banderites or what the Ustashi in Croatia or some of these groups in Latvia, Estonia, and Hungary did. But,
Correct.
in Russia, he's not honored. I'll tell you right now, he's not honored at all. And on the other hand, you see how the Kiev regime and how some of these other countries in the former Soviet bloc treat such figures. It's a real tell-all, or it should be anyway.
Well, I mean, what the European Union in the last 20 or 30 years has brought these small state, unreconstructed Nazism right into the heart of the Brussels machine. Either ex-KGB. I mean, as I said, we're run by Soviets. Kayag Kallas is a Soviet. A lot of the Balts who have a disproportionate influence on our policy in Brussels because they sit on some of the security portfolios. They grew up during the Soviet Union, so we've got say the EU and the Russia are run by ex-KGB people. Well done, KGB. If you and ditto, we've got a lot of dirty Nazis, and it's people like Timothy Garton Ash and the BBC and Edward Lucas who whitewashed these guys. Because Yalta justifies everything, and we imported these people right into our policy-making machinery. Yeah. Sorry.
And, it's interesting, too, how some of these people can go from being part of the Nazi apparatus to the communist. I heard this said about Caius's background, at least some in her family. I heard this about the Landsbergises in Lithuania, some of them anyway. You guys, I think, are movie buffs. There was this movie that came out some years ago. It centers around a Hungarian Jewish family in the interwar years. And one of the bad guy characters, he's depicted during the war as this guy who is collaborating with the Nazis. But then when World War II ends, he's diehard with the Stalinist Rakoshi. I mean, it's interesting how some of these people can go with the flow, whatever it is at the time.
Exactly. And by the way, lest we forget, Mike, can you update us on, is Krista Freeland has not been heard much from lately. And here is this lady. She was Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. She was Foreign Minister of Canada. She was one of the driving forces urging Ukraine to go to war with Russia, urging the Ukrainians to bleed and die to the last Ukrainian. She is of Ukrainian ethnic background herself. On her mother's side, her maternal grandfather was a war criminal. He was one of the top collaborators with the Nazis during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. It was really a civil war in Ukraine because most Ukrainians that came to loathe the Nazis even more than they loathed the communists, as you well know, and fought desperately for the liberation of their country. But those, especially from far western Ukraine, many of them threw in their lot with the Nazis. And Krista Freeland's grandfather actually is documented as having visited Auschwitz when it was in operation. He was the publisher of the main Nazi-backed propagandist newspaper during the occupation in Ukraine. He knew everything that was going on in Auschwitz, and at the very least did not raise a finger of objection to any of it. Quite the contrary. Now, what is this energetic lady who, of course, has reinvented herself as a champion of human rights, though ferociously anti-Russian to the nth degree, again, as you say, is there any word of where she's at these days?
Well, by the way, she describes herself as a Russophile, and it sort of brings to mind, you remember Strobe Talbot?
Oh, very well indeed.
Okay.
Absolutely. I've had my run-ins with him and his supporters. Go on.
Well, let me say this about Strobe. If you remember when he was being considered for a position in the Clinton administration, there was open debate that this guy is too soft on Russia. And I'm like, say what? Say what? He was never soft on Russia, but this tells you how the mood swing is on Capitol Hill. Someone like Zbigniew Brzezinski can become national security advisor, but on the other hand, Talbot is considered possibly being too soft for a position in government less that of the national security advisor. Now, in terms of what Freeland has been doing of late, I have Mr. Google here. She did get a special position as unpaid economic advisor to Zelensky earlier this year, but she then resigned, and now she's warden of Rhodes House and chief executive officer of the Rhodes Trust, something I know nothing about. But I'm sure. I'm sorry.
Let me chime in there. No, I can inform you, Mike. Is this Rhodes House in Canada or Rhodes House in London and Oxford? Either way, the Rhodes institutions were funded by the fortune of one of the most notorious genocidal imperialists in world. And
I'm
British
sorry,
history.
Oxford. Yes, Cecil Rhodes.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Rhodes House in Oxford is exactly is funded to maintain and revive Anglo-Saxon superiority and political domination around the world. Lord Milner was a driving force of it back in the 1920s. They're much more lower key in recent decades, but since the revival of Britain, both economically and psychologically, most of all, since the time of Mrs. Thatcher, they've raised their heads very strongly again. They are enormous to basically bring America into the British orbit and to confront Russia. And they've always regarded Russia, whether it was communist or not communist, makes no difference to them, as the source of all evil. Rhodes himself was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the world. He developed the diamond mines of South Africa. He was the mastermind behind the seizing of the gold and diamond mines of the Boer republics in the 1898 to 1999 Boer War. He also masterminded personally the genocide, the literal extermination of the Matabele people by wiping them out with deliberately infected smallpox in the 1890s so Britain could take over much of Africa. His dream was for Britain to literally directly control half of Africa, the entire eastern half of Africa. It was his personal project. It sounds insane. He pulled it off. It was completed 20 years after his death, after World War I, when the British took over former German Tanganyika, and they'd already taken over Sudan. So you could have a Cape to Cairo railroad. Now, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, as world history changed, the British were pushed out of direct control of most of the nations of Africa, but their indirect influence and even control, certainly over resources, remains. And to this day, the Rhodes Trust is central to this. So the fact that Krista is working in Oxford means that she may be low-key, but she is absolutely at the center of directing Anglo-American power dedicated to the dissolution of Russia and ultimately the enslavement and destitution of the Russian people. This is an enormously important development you've pointed out to us.
Yeah, well, and these people, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm invited on all these Canadian shows, and I get invited once because I praise Russia and criticize Ukraine. Of course, Canada's got a huge Ukraine lobby, and I think that the Brits, of course, are very keen to bring using Trump, the administration, to bring Canada back into the Commonwealth fold, if you like. People like Mark Carney and now Chrystia Freeland are used as sort of ways to bring the senior Dominion back into the fold and leverage British power. But over to you, Michael. Sorry.
I mean, these people, they have plenty of different forums to go to. For example, Baerbock, she's been the General Assembly president. She'll bounce somewhere, the Tony Blair Institute. There's McCain Institute. There's something for the German Marshall Fund. There's plenty for these people to bounce to and make a good living at it.
That's right.
Exactly.
And, speaking of, this project I'm researching at the moment, HIMARS, the Swedish UN Secretary General, the reason why the Brits were opposed to him because they just killed lots of people in Kenya and they didn't want that being exposed. And I was also, Sharpeville, where 35 blacks were killed by the South African. That's the sort of seminal event of the anti-apartheid struggle. But I mean, the Brits had just killed far more people, far more brutally in Kenya and the Mau Mau uprisings. I mean, it's staggering. If you read Caroline Elkins, I think she's written 2 books about it, and that happened just as Macmillan was making his Winds of Change speak, like weeks before this was winding up, and then they destroyed a lot of the archives. So whenever you think that the Russians do bad things because of Stalin, the Brits do bad things, it's just that they literally burn up all their archives of their entire colonial history. Sorry, yeah, Martin.
They have a nice spin. They have a nice spin game going for sure. And the rest of the world knows this. Unfortunately, our well-educated friends here in the West, they continue to rely on the BBC, and they think they have a very good idea of what's going on when they don't. In the meantime, I'm hearing that RT, Sputnik, the Russian position in the so-called global South is doing rather well. And that's the key to future. There's a growing world out there besides Europe and North America, and there's plenty of room for Russia to grow with it. And this is something that these Russian oligarchs, who are kind of designated as being the most pro-Western in Russia, I think will come to realize. I mean, take, for example, Kirill Dmitriev, who John Helm has often discussed. Look, this guy's Kiev born, and he has made comments clearly non-supportive of the Kiev regime. And I just wonder how much of a fifth columnist he is, if he can even be called one, because, one can be an American file while recognizing the limits. We're not anti-American. We're against the neocon, neo-lib foreign policy establishment, but we love America. We love Europe, okay? But, Dmitriev, he should also recall Scott Besson called him a Kremlin propagandist. And so you'd think that this Russian business class that had ties with the West, they realized the limits. Someone like Abramovich, for example, should he be mad at the Russian government or the Brit establishment for having to sell the Chelsea Football Club? The Russian government didn't make him sell it.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. There was a comment attributed, it's well documented, to President Harry Truman in his book of interviews, Plain Speaking with Merle Miller. He was discussing the political power in the Democratic Party of Joe Kennedy. And Truman was a very shrewd and acute and also cynical populist politician, made the point that vast sums of money have a vast political gravitational pull. You don't even have to bother to bribe people. A vast number of people are so obsessed with getting even a tiny fraction of wealth, which they never do, that they will do the bidding of the oligarchs without being paid a penny, because they dream that they will be paid a pretty penny or two in the future. And I've seen this in my own career. I resigned from the Globalist, a very easy thing for me to do for many reasons. But
I know them. Yeah,
exactly. I analyzed with them and regarded myself as a personal friend of the publisher for a decade. He's back in Berlin now, the last thing I heard. But he told me in 2014, and this was just right after the Maidan coup, which I was outspoken at the time in condemning, and I was appearing on RT in condemning it. I wasn't allowed to condemn it in any American media outlet at the time. Very interestingly enough, I think you had similar experiences at that very same time, Mike. Mm-hmm. But he told me, in no uncertain terms, I must not write anything that was either favorable or even neutral towards Russia. I could only write stuff that was hostile to Russia. And I actually said to him, well, I don't write anything. I know what your editorial stance is, and I don't write on Russian affairs for the Globalist anyway. And the publisher, who had always presented himself as a great liberal champion of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, was all lies, was all hypocrisy, of course. It was all a fairy tale. And I was under no illusion about that. But he said, no, you don't understand, Martin. You must stop writing anything that is even-handed, let alone in any way supportive, quote unquote, of Russian policy, or explaining why they're doing this or why they're doing that from their perspective in any outlet that you choose to write, not just the globalist. To which I replied, with apologies for our sensitive viewership out there, fuck you, I'm walking. And I did immediately, which apparently was not what he expected. And I have not spoken a word to the son of a bitch since, except when he invited me a few weeks later, trying to charm me to a morning breakfast in Washington, which he was too cheap to even pay for. And that was very much his style. But the point is, this is the inherent depth, and this was more than 12 years ago, of anti-Russian bias. And this is not to say that Russia is a democracy in Western terms. It clearly is not. They have their own way. It is not to say that the Russians are always peace-loving and harmless. On the contrary, my fear is that the Russian deputy foreign minister's warning that you guys have pointed out is all too right, and we could be on the danger of full inconceivable war with Russia. We should not regard them as kumbaya, peace-loving flower lovers. If they were, we could abuse them at will, but they're not like that. We have to respect them and take them seriously, because otherwise the consequences will be indescribable. I'm sorry, go on, Mike.
Yes, well, sorry, gentlemen, we've got to wind up. We've got 2 minutes left. I'm just going to say something like you can like Russia or not like Russian, but the reason why we talk about Russia is that the Russian perspective, they've got an army, as it were, an army backing a television channel, which allows some of their truth to get out. But once you believe that there is another truth, not the whole truth, and it's propagandistic, but that propaganda has to be set against the propaganda of the West. It's almost like a sort of what's the word, Descartesian revelation or something, or that there's a world out there, there's an objective world out there that doesn't just live in the Western bubble. And at the moment, I mean, Russians are much more keen to get this third picture out, even though you have to caveat it and all that. The Chinese are not interested in spreading the truth, but the Russians are, after all, European. And so there are cousins in a way, and they're very, very keen to have their story out. So they're fighting with us or fighting with the West for the narrative. And I think, in a way, if you just, for the moment, just set aside the danger of war with Russia, which is almost like a sort of like Vesuvius erupting on all the corrupt Roman leaders, that's what's going to happen, you know, people taking life too easy and totally ignorant, and our political class is like that. They don't know they're dancing on a volcano, and us are warning against it because they're going to have to pay the price. But the trouble is, not just them, it's all of us who are going to pay the price. It's also that we're warning about, but also, I mean, we're dedicated to truth. I'm trying to map out the world's dark secrets in a way, and once you step outside the BBC and all those other things that Michael talks about, you realize that I mean, the British, we've lived in a century of British propaganda, and you can unpeel it one by one. And the point is, it's not that you're anti-British, you're pro-Western in a way, because the West is about truth. The West is about inquiry, scientific, historical inquiry. So I think what we're actually doing is contributing to the revival or the sustainment of Western civilized Enlightenment values, you know, even if it meant challenging the powers of the day, as did our heroic ancestor intellectuals of the 17th and 18th centuries. Anyway, Michael, we've got 30 seconds left. Do you want to comment on anything I just said, or sort of wind up what your thoughts are? You must come on again soon, by the way.
Exactly.
Will do. You know, very quickly, you know, I recently had an off-record confidentiality respected with a former editor of a venue based in Europe, which I've had numerous issues with. And he confided to me, you know, Mike, I'm basically in agreement with you, but understand, I'm not able to run that kind of commentary.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, well, you can run it here, and that's why people tune in. So thank you so much, Michael. Thanks, Martin. See you tomorrow. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you, Pelle. Thank you, Mike.